eat poker. And so Hoover wasn't a totally abstemious kind of puritanical guy, but the Harding White House was sort of notorious for the fact that the president liked to kick off from work early and then get a poker game going. And by the way, remember, alcohol is illegal in the United States of America. I guess, unless you're the president, it's fine, right? And so remember, prohibition is being enforced, but there are these huge loopholes. In New York City, for example, if you have a restaurant with a wine cellar, you could distribute to customers existing stuff that you'd already had when prohibition started. So obviously all of the restaurants just bought all the alcohol they could find and stocked it all. One restaurant in New York City had so much champagne in their wine cellar that they had a regular New Year's Eve party until the end of prohibition and never ran out of champagne. Every year they had a New Year's Eve party. So I mean, there's a big double standard. If you were the working class saloon down the road from the tenement, obviously you can't afford a wine cellar. You're buying beer every week in shipments. You're out of business, right? And so there was some illegal alcohol in the White House. Also, on the other hand, some of it was stuff that they had bought. The White House had bought before prohibition was enacted. But still, it's a little sketchy that Harding would sort of flaunt the law in that way. But then again, sketchy is kind of his thing. And so a few other distinctions we can make. Harding is actually the first president to give a speech over the radio, not a rebroadcast or anything, but actually when they dedicated the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., Harding gave a big speech, and it was broadcast while he gave the speech live on the radio, which is a first in presidential politics, so that's great. So when Harding dies, on the one hand, nobody's particularly upset to see the back of him. Harding was definitely the compromised candidate in the 1920 Republican Convention. There were a number of candidates. The convention was deadlocked, and Harding was the sort of everybody's second choice and nobody's first choice, so that was where he got in. But everybody likes his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, the only president from Vermont. Coolidge had been a judge before becoming a presidential candidate. When he was in Vermont when he heard the news of Harding's death. He's also one of the only presidents sworn in by a state judge. His father was a county judge, judge of the peace, justice of the peace, and swore him in at their home. When he got the news, he went over to his father's house, and his father produced the family Bible and swore him in right there. And so Coolidge was often known as Silent Cal, and in a sense he was policy-wise not very different than Harding. He thought that big regulations and the expansion of government under the progressives had been a mistake, had been a problem, shouldn't be continued, and as a result, he sort of kept those things up. And so the good stories I can tell you about Calvin Coolidge, for example, is that when at a party, the thing was and so at a party, a woman came up to him and said, Mr. Coolidge, I bet I can't get you to say 6 words. And he said, you lose. And so that was sort of Silent Cal, right? And so a few things we can mention about Calvin Coolidge that will make him perhaps in some sense more sympathetic. He lost his son in the White House, a very, very young boy, about the same age as Abraham Lincoln's son, Willie Lincoln, who died of a typhoid fever. What happened to Calvin Coolidge's son, which is almost unspeakably tragic, is that he was on the lawn of the White House playing lawn tennis, and he got a blister on his foot. He was wearing leather shoes. And the blister popped and got an infection, and the kid got septicemia and died. And so understand that today, if you got the exact same thing happen, right? If you got a blister and it popped, you would just go get something like bacitracin, put it on your blister, get a Band-Aid, put a Band-Aid over the bacitracin. And if you got an infection, you just take some antibiotics, which would be available over the counter, right? The problem is that stuff is a little bit more than a decade away, and as a result, Calvin Coolidge's son dies. And it was an almost unspeakable, kind of terrifying, awful thing to contemplate. And it dealt him a very heavy blow. He never really recovered. Abraham Lincoln maintained a facade of cheerfulness, but was also deeply affected by his son's death. But he tried to sort of talk about his son and memorialize him, and they kept his things around the house, and they sort of, it kept his memory alive. Calvin Coolidge just never talked about it and never spoke about it. And so he finished Harding's term, 1923 to 24, was elected in his own right and served until 1929, not running again in 1928. The other thing that Calvin Coolidge indulged in is a mania for the federal budget. And so he thought the federal government spends money on useless, frivolous things, but it was sort of a crazy, kind of bizarre thing. He would go through the federal budget line by line and try to shrink expenditures. And a wonderful example is the post office. So the post office buys wool sacks for the mail. Well, they bleach them white, and then they stencil paint the logo of the Postal Service in blue, right? So Calvin Coolidge sits down with a slide rule and a piece of paper, and he comes up with the idea that if the post office buys the wool sacks does not bleach them, and then just stencils the blue logo over it, they would save like, a penny per sack, which is like $10,000 a year, right? So Coolidge is like on the phone to the post office telling them, don't bleach the mail sacks anymore. And so they don't. And so on the one hand, I guess that's great. You shrunk the federal budget by like a fraction of 0.1%. On the other hand, this is the sort of minutia that Calvin Coolidge got sort of obsessed with. And the iconic sort of moment, the test of Calvin Coolidge's presidential career, comes in 1927. The Mississippi River is the biggest river in the United States. It is fed by a series of tributaries, particularly the Missouri River, which goes all the way up into Montana. What happened is that the conditions in the 20s were very odd. The summers were short and cool. The winters were just sort of right, so that the ice built up and it didn't melt. And what happened too was very dangerous was when the ice would melt, it would melt for a little bit and then freeze again. Sort of building up like a pack ice where there would be ice over snow, so that even when it would get a little warmer, the bottom levels wouldn't really melt. And all this came to a point in 1927 where the Mississippi River, there was a very, very, very hot spell, particularly up in the upper Midwest. It melts all the ice up in the mountains, all the ice in the tributaries. All of the tributaries of the Mississippi flood, and all that water goes right down to the Mississippi. And so from basically southern Illinois to Louisiana, to New Orleans, Louisiana, the Mississippi River tops its banks. And at one point, the flooding is so bad that if you were to look at it from an airplane, the Mississippi River is 100 miles wide. Its new western bank is 100 miles to the west of its new eastern bank, which means you can fly over the Mississippi River in an airplane and at that point not have seen the banks. Not have been able to see the east bank or the west bank. If you were able to see one, you would see the other. And so the flooding is disastrous. It's arguably one of the worst natural disasters in the history of the United States of America by a wide margin, worse than the Chicago fire or the San Francisco earthquake or any of the hurricanes that we've had. And things get bad fast. When the rains are coming in and everybody's warning of an impending flood, there's violence up and down the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River's east bank has got walls, levees all along it to protect the state of Mississippi and the state of Louisiana from flooding. The west bank, of course, is just going to flood, right? So all up and down the levees, people are worried that people to the south of them are going to blow up their levee, right? If I live to the south of you and I get in a boat and go all up the river and throw dynamite at your section of the levee, you'll flood and I won't, right? So people are marching back and forth on the levees with shotguns and people with rumors of dynamite getting smuggled up and down the river. And when the flooding happens, it doesn't even matter. The levees get overtopped and they get broken down and that's it, right? Remember when Katrina flooded New Orleans in 2005, it was like a 25-foot breach and one of the levees flooded the entire city. And so this is an order of magnitude worse. And so Coolidge doesn't do anything. When people come in, they tell him, look, Mr. President, the Mississippi River's topped the levees. It's a disaster of epic proportions. Hundreds of thousands of people have been homeless. Millions of acres of farmland is gone. Buildings are destroyed. Towns are flooded. Potentially tens of thousands of people have died. And the humanitarian disaster is going to be worse because people are going to get sick. There's going to be mosquitoes. There's going to be malaria. There's going to be starvation. Coolidge is like, well, the federal government, it's not our problem, is it? And of course, somebody is like, well, you could do something, but you don't have to. And so he's like, okay, well, the states can probably figure it out. And so, I mean, consider that today, where if a natural disaster happened and the president was like, well, it's not the federal government's problem, so we're just not going to do anything. That's effectively what Calvin Coolidge said, right? To be fair, FEMA and this sort of thing didn't really exist, but on the other hand, it's not the federal government couldn't have done something. And so things get, as you might imagine, bad before they get better. And so the Red Cross comes in and begins to organize relief efforts. And that's where former Commerce Secretary Herbert Hoover comes in. He's appointed director of the emergency relief efforts for the Red Cross. And so, as you might imagine, in order to clear this up, some of the states had taken to dragooning labor to rebuild the levees or to build flood breaks and things. Since the southern states, we're talking about Mississippi and things, what kind of labor were they talking about? Well, basically what they did is they rounded up black men at gunpoint, took them away from their homes and families, and forced them to work in the rain and in flood conditions to fill sandbags and do this kind of stuff, right? And so the Red Cross coming in is widely seen as a sort of like, they'll hopefully be able to fix some of this stuff, right? Hoover himself is an interesting fellow. He's from Dubuque, Iowa. He was a geologist and a mining engineer with a mining company for a long time. Had been to a number of foreign countries in his early career. And so he'd been Commerce Secretary under Warren G. Harding. Everyone thought that he did a pretty good job, but he resigned after some of the his scandalous behavior in the administration came to light. And so what you say about Hoover, though, is he's got a very good public reputation. Towards the end of World War I, when the British blockade of Germany was really collapsing the German economy and starving people, Hoover went to President Wilson. And he said, Mr. President, we've got a bumper crop of wheat in America this year. They're starving people in Europe. Shouldn't we feed these people? Shouldn't we load up the grain and just take it over there? And Wilson thought it was a good idea. So he said to Hoover, you do it, right? I'll give you the authority. We'll start a program. The government will buy the wheat from the farmers. We'll ship it over to Europe, and we'll feed starving people. And so people called Hoover the great humanitarian. He was this guy that, of his own volition, didn't take a salary to do this, and he fed millions of people in Europe in the winter of 1918 and into 1919. He fed Russians to death for the Civil War. In fact, until the Russian government began confiscating the wheat in order to sell it and make a profit, we fed people in Russia, even as the Civil War was raging. And so everybody thinks, okay, Hoover is the guy, right? And so, in a sense, the Mississippi River flood of 1927 was Hoover's sort of greatest and a very ominous moment for him. On the one hand, things get a lot better. The Red Cross comes in, they set up hospitals, they work to evacuate people, they get people out of the floodwaters, they organize things to drain some of the flooded areas, they move in resources so that people can rebuild and stuff, they take care of injured people. It's exactly what you would expect the Red Cross to do, right? It's the sort of things that anybody would do in a disaster today, right? But then there's this weird thing that Hoover develops, this tick or this kind of habit. He sort of, in his mind, he gets this thing, he says to reporters that since the Red Cross has taken over the relief effort, nobody's died. Nobody's died. That's what he says. Nobody's died since the Red Cross took over. So in the beginning, what Hoover's saying is things are under control, it's getting better, nobody's died, okay. The reporters, when they start to take it as a kind of a personal challenge, right? So they find out that in fact people have died. Okay, so a sick guy died. Well, he might have died too. But then they find out that there are still people who are gotten aid, who are still needing to be evacuated, and these people are still in danger and are still dying. So they go back to Hoover and they're like, gosh, Mr. Hoover, it kind of looks like that's not accurate, right? And instead of saying, I didn't know about that, or I misspoke, or the deaths have dropped dramatically, or whatever, instead he just repeats this sort of robotic kind of monotone, no, since I took over, nobody's died. And so it displays this alarming kind of ideological or intellectual rigidity that Hoover, once he takes this position, can't climb down, right? Won't back off and won't admit that okay, well, I misspoke, or I did say this, I was wrong when I said that, or whatever. Instead, all he can do is just repeat himself over and over again, right? And so if you're studying Hoover closely, that's ominous. On the other hand, he still comes out quite well in the flood crisis. The Red Cross is seen as instrumental in preventing what would have been a much more serious loss of life and helping the region get back on its feet. And so Hoover emerges as a figure of sort of national attention, right? So what can we say about Hoover? Hoover runs in 1928 for the presidency. He runs against former New York Governor Al Smith, no fan of Theodore Roosevelt. Al Smith, an Irish boy from New York City. Smith was the first Catholic to run for the presidency. When his father got a job in New York, he was a security guard on the construction project that became the Brooklyn Bridge. And at one point in the 1880s, he took Smith over as a young boy on his shoulders when the Brooklyn Bridge was 2x4 stretched across a framework on the river. And they said that Papa Smith took Al Smith over, and Mama Smith said, "Oh, pray the rosary," that didn't fall in the river, right? And so Smith comes out of the Democratic politics in New York City, the sort of machine politics that had gone away by the turn of the 20th century, but he's sort of not generally seen as a kind of reform-minded progressive in the way that sort of Wilson had been, right? And so the problem with Smith is he's Catholic. The Ku Klux Klan is in its big revival. They see themselves as white Anglo-Saxon Protestant defenders of what is 100% Americanism. The idea of a papist, a Catholic inhabiting the White House is for them a disaster, right? And so Smith, the Republican vote surges in the southern states, not so much because they like Republicans, but rather they would rather vote for a Protestant as opposed to a Catholic, right? And so it widely accepted as a truism of early 20th century politics after the drubbing of Smith that a Catholic just is going to get to the White House, right? It's just not, as a good Protestant, the churches say you couldn't really vote for a Catholic, right? And we'll see the same thing when Kennedy runs in 1960, where there are these rumors that he would be taking orders from the Pope, he's going to force everybody to go to Catholic school or whatever. The big thing is Smith is going to close down all the schools in the South and make everyone go to Catholic school, which would be completely insane. But sort of that's sort of what goes around the churches, right? And so Hoover becomes president in 1928, right? Now, what happens in 1929 abruptly is the stock market collapses in the fall of that year. Right? So Hoover's got a brief honeymoon as president before things begin to get very bad. And you can see here, this is a crowd outside the New York Stock Exchange on the day that the stock